The leash went tight in Carla's hand. Axel froze mid-step, tail rigid, eyes locked on something just beyond the brush. She followed his stare. There, at the base of a collapsed oak, slumped against the roots like forgotten wreckage, was a man. Skin pale, wrists bound. No words, no name, only a patch clinging to a torn jacket. 101st Airborne. What Axel did next didn't just uncover a man, it awakened a truth the town. If this story finds a place in you, hit subscribe and tell us where you watching from, and what would you have done that day? The air was dense with mist, the kind that clings to the trees like forgotten ghosts. Pines towered like sentinels, their needles slick with dawn's dew. Deputy Carla Finch adjusted the collar of her uniform, her breath clouding in front of her lips, and glanced at the empty leash in her hand. Axel, she called again, was known for impulsivity, especially not Axel. He had served on the force for 4 years, a black and tan German shepherd with eyes like coals that never blinked unless they meant to. He wasn't just any dog, he was meticulous, unbreakable, and never once broke protocol. Until last night, Carla had found his kennel broken from the inside, padlock snapped clean, latch bent with a force that seemed impossible for a creature with paws. No signs of struggle, no noise reported. Just gone. And now she was 5 miles deep into Pine Ridge Forest, following nothing but disturbed leaves, shallow paw prints, and the gut feeling that something wasn't right. Her boots cracked twigs beneath her step, but her pace slowed as the silence grew heavier. Axel had vanished beyond a thicket, and there was something unnatural about how the woods swallowed sound here. The chirps, the wind, they were gone. She passed the remains of an old game trail, barely visible beneath the moss and damp pine needles. And that's when she saw it. Axel frozen, tail stiff, ears locked forward, standing just yards ahead at the edge of a low-lying gully. Axel, she whispered, her voice softer now, cautious. He didn't move, didn't look at her. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, one paw, then another, then stopped again. He was pointing. Carla reached for her radio, but the static was all she got. No signal this deep in. She descended the slope carefully, keeping her eyes where Axel's gaze remained fixed. That's when she saw him, at the base of a partially fallen oak, nearly hidden beneath weeks of leaves and the soft rot of forest debris, was a man. At first, she thought it was a mannequin. The body so still, the posture slumped in a way that made time feel like it had paused. But then the wind shifted, and she saw the slight rise of his chest, barely breathing. She rushed forward, dropping to one knee. "Sir, hey sir, can you hear me?" Her voice broke the silence like glass. He didn't respond. Wrist drawn behind the trunk, tied with what looked like military-grade zip ties. His skin raw beneath the binding. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollowed, lips cracked and crusted with blood. His eyes were half open, but vacant, cloudy, and staring through. Carla tore off her jacket and wrapped it around his shoulders. He didn't flinch, but something in his posture changed, just a twitch, almost imperceptible. "Hang in there," she muttered, fumbling with her belt radio again. Still nothing. She placed 2 fingers under his jaw. Pulse faint but there. Her gaze fell to his chest. No wallet, no dog tags, but a patch sewn clumsily to the inside of his torn flannel shirt, half rotted by sweat and time. 101st Airborne Division. Her breath caught. She looked up at Axel. He hadn't moved. His eyes were still fixed on the man. Not as a threat, as something else. Something familiar. Axel stepped forward now, slow and deliberate, and pressed his body against the man's side, his head resting gently across the man's knees like he had done it before, like he belonged there. "Jesus Christ," Carla whispered, her voice breaking. "Who are you?" She tried slicing the zip ties with her utility knife, but they were cinched too tight. With a deep breath, she stood, dragging her phone from her pocket, raising it high to try and catch a single bar. One. Just one, a blip. She tapped for emergency services and held her breath. Dialing. It connected. "Sheriff Hammond, this is Deputy Finch," she said quickly. "Live male, elderly. Found bound and restrained about 200 yards west of mile marker 12. Suspected hypothermia. Need EMS." Back at the man's side. She placed her hand gently against his neck to check for bruising. That's when she saw it, faint but distinct beneath the grime. Circular pressure marks, high on the wrist. She froze. Those weren't random restraints. They were tactical, measured, precise, and set at nerve-deadening points. Military. Carla stared at the man's face again. He blinked, slowly. His eyes flicked once toward Axel. His lips parted. Breath rattled. And then the barest whisper, "You found me." It wasn't clear whether he was talking to her or the dog. Carla knelt beside Axel, resting a hand on the K9's strong back. He stayed pressed to the man's legs like a soldier who had finally returned to post. Somewhere behind her, the trees rustled. Not wind, something else. The forest was watching. Carla didn't know who this man was, or why he had been left here like a ghost someone hoped the woods would swallow. But Axel did, and that meant this wasn't over. This was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of County General flickered overhead as the gurney rolled past the rusting metal doors. Nurses murmured to one another, glancing down at the man lying motionless under an olive-drab blanket. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes closed, one arm riddled with old bruises and more recent ones purple-black with yellowing edges like storm clouds in retreat. His pulse was barely there, but it was steady. Deputy Carla Finch followed closely, Axel at her side, the leash slack but the dog still alert, ears twitching at every sound, eyes locked on the man whose name no one yet knew. Elias Moore hadn't said a word during the entire ambulance ride. His eyes fluttered once when they'd lifted him into the rig, and when Axel jumped in beside him uninvited, but undeterred his lips parted just enough to whisper those 7 syllables. "You found me, didn't you?" And then silence again. The words had not been meant for Carla. The softness in them, the tremble, the weight they were for, the dog. The connection between the two was not just familiarity. It was recognition, and it unsettled Carla in a way she couldn't explain. Inside Trauma Room 2B, the ER team moved with clinical precision. Fluids were started, IVs inserted. A heated blanket placed over his legs. When the charge nurse peeled back the collar of Elias's shirt, her gloved fingers paused. "Doctor," she said quietly, "you're gonna want it." Tucked into the lining of the shirt, barely noticeable, was a worn, sweat-stained pocket sewn shut with red thread. Not military issue. Hand done. Careful, deliberate. The attending physician, Dr. Grace Morton, a former Army field medic turned ER lead, narrowed her eyes. "Get me scissors," she said. A nurse handed her a sterile pair, and with slow, careful movements, she cut the seam. Inside was a single item, a folded piece of yellowed paper, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. She opened it gently. There, preserved through sweat, soil, and time, was an old black-and-white photo, creased in 4 directions, edges curling, one corner torn. 3 men stood shoulder to shoulder, arms around each other, all in fatigues, all young, laughing. Grace leaned in, her brows drawing together. The man on the right, his grin wide, his hair shorter than regulation, was unmistakable. Sheriff Ryland Boone. Before the salt and pepper hair, before the badge, but still him. "Well, hell," she muttered. "That can't be right." Carla, watching from the doorway with her arms crossed, took a few steps forward. "Did you say Ryland?" Grace didn't answer at first. She handed the photo to a nurse and told her to scan and preserve it, then turned toward Carla. "You're gonna want to ask your boss what he was doing in Vietnam with a man you just found chained to a tree." Axel, lying by Elias's bed, lifted his head at the mention of Ryland's name. His eyes flicked from Carla to the photo and back again. Something stirred in him like a thread being tugged, a memory woven into instinct. Back at the sheriff's office, Ryland Boone poured black coffee into a chipped mug, steam rising around his weathered face. He hadn't slept. When Carla called in from mile marker 12, his gut had clenched like a fist, the kind of clench you don't admit to, not when you're wearing stars on your collar. He hadn't gone to the scene, claimed it was protocol, let Carla take point, but truth was, something about that patch Carla described over the radio 101st Airborne stirred something cold in his spine. He hadn't worn that patch in decades, hadn't spoken that name aloud since the day he took the badge, and now someone out there, someone still alive, was wearing it stitched to a coat found rotting on a dying man's chest. Back at the hospital, Grace checked Elias's vitals again. Still non-verbal. Could be trauma, could be deliberate. She glanced at the photo again. "But I've seen soldiers like this before. This kind of silence? It's not because he's broken, it's because he remembers exactly what happened, and he's not ready to speak it. Carla nodded slowly. Do we have a name? Grace shook her head. No ID, no tags. Just the patch and that photo. Then I'll find him a name, Carla said. She looked down at Elias. His eyes were still closed, but something in his expression had shifted. A softness. A kind of peace you only saw in soldiers finally off the battlefield. Later that night, Carla stood by the hospital window, the photo held tight between her fingers. She flipped it over. On the back, a scribble in faded blue ink. Moore, Boone, Santiago. We made it home. All three. The last name chilled her. Moore, as in Elias Moore? But there had never been a case file. No missing persons report. No alerts. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. Down the hall, Axel sat like a stone at Elias's bedside. A nurse tried to coax him away with food, but he didn't flinch, didn't blink. His eyes stayed fixed on Elias's face. At one point, Elias shifted in his sleep. His hand twitched toward the dog. Barely a movement, but Axel lifted his head and pressed his muzzle gently into the man's fingers. It was a moment no one else saw. And maybe that was the point. Carla didn't go home that night. She sat in the ER lounge, the photo on the table, a legal pad next to it filled with scribbled notes. She wrote the same name over and over, Elias Moore. Then, underneath it, another, Ryland Boone. The paper blurred as her thoughts wandered. 3 soldiers, one lost, one silenced, one with power, and between them, a dog who wouldn't speak because he didn't have to. His loyalty was already telling the truth. The next morning, Carla walked into Ryland's office, photo in hand. He looked up, weary. Before she said a word, she laid the photo down in front of him. He stared at it, didn't touch it, didn't blink. His lips parted slightly. Where'd you get that? Pocket of a man you didn't tell me you knew. Ryland leaned back slowly in his chair, jaw tight. I need you to tell me what this is, Carla said, because the man in that bed may not make it. And whatever he's carrying, he carried it a long damn way just to die in our woods. Ryland didn't speak, but his eyes dropped, locked on the image of his younger self and 2 ghosts. His throat tightened, fingers curling around the edge of the desk. Finally, he said, almost too quiet to hear, I thought he was dead. And then his hand reached for the photo. Ryland Boone's hand trembled slightly as he pulled open the bottom drawer of his old wooden filing cabinet. The lock had been broken for years, more symbolic than secure, but what it contained was never meant to be seen by anyone else. His office was quiet, the blinds pulled halfway shut, casting tired shadows across his desk. The photo Carla had given him still lay there. 3 young men frozen in a moment of brotherhood, their faces so vivid despite the decades. As the drawer creaked open, Ryland pushed aside a stack of manila folders until his fingers brushed the battered edge of an olive green envelope. No labels, no dates, just a government stamp half faded by time and secrecy. He hesitated before pulling it out. Once, a long time ago, he'd sworn he'd never open it again, that the past would stay buried where it belonged. But Elias Moore wasn't buried. He was lying 2 miles away in a hospital bed, half dead, and his dog Axel was already seeing what others refused to. Ryland placed the envelope on the desk and peeled it open slowly. Inside were 4 items. A typed field report, a confidential investigation file, a folded topographic map of Fujian province, and a handwritten note scrawled in uneven, pressured pen. He said no. He refused. We all heard it. No signature, just that sentence. As Ryland scanned the report, the tension in his chest deepened. The field summary, dated July 3, 1972, detailed Operation Clearing Fog, a search and destroy mission allegedly targeting a Viet Cong munitions depot nestled in a civilian village. The report declared success. No American casualties. Hostile neutralization confirmed. But Ryland knew the truth. He'd been there, he remembered the screaming, the women, the children. He remembered Moore standing in front of the captain's jeep, rifle slung but both hands raised, blocking the order. They're civilians, Elias had said. We don't fire. The captain overrode him. The rest of the unit obeyed. Elias didn't. For that they labeled him insubordinate. The government didn't prosecute him. They erased him. Ryland stared at the edge of the photo again. Moore's smile haunted him now, not for its youth, but for its truth. A man who lived with conviction, even when everyone else chose comfort. A man who saved Ryland's life in a rice paddy 2 weeks later, dragging his body through sniper fire when others panicked. Elias had kept his word, and now, 40 years later, Ryland wondered what that promise had cost. Meanwhile, at County General, Axel paced the hallway outside Elias' room. His tail was down, his posture rigid. Every time a uniformed officer passed by, his ears flattened and a low, guttural growl built in his throat. Nurses gave him space, respecting the line he wouldn't let anyone cross. But when Lieutenant Brian Weller stepped into the hallway, badge polished, shoes too clean, Axel's demeanor changed entirely. His growl deepened, and his stance lowered, shoulders forward like he was bracing. Carla, seated nearby with a tablet in hand, looked up. "What's wrong with him?" she asked, standing slowly. Weller, unfazed, chuckled under his breath. "Must be the smell of duty." He moved to pass the dog, but Axel snarled and lunged forward, stopped only by Carla's firm grip on the leash. "Well, hey, back off," Weller snapped, stepping back. "Control your mud." Carla's eyes narrowed. Axel had never reacted like this, not even during narcotics busts. Not even during narcotics busts. Something primal. "He's reacting to you," Carla said. "Why?" Weller scoffed, adjusting his belt. "Hell if I know. Maybe he smells whatever they gave that old guy in the forest." "What's his name again?" "He doesn't have one yet," Carla replied. Her voice clipped. "But maybe you do." Later that day, while reviewing security footage from the hospital, Carla noticed something odd. Each time Weller passed Elias's room, Axel would rise, growl, and position himself between the door and the man inside. It wasn't just suspicion, it was recognition. Not from training, but from history. That evening, Ryland arrived at the hospital. He carried the envelope in his hand, gripped tightly like a confession he hadn't practiced. Carla met him at the elevator. "He hasn't woken up again," she said. "But Axel, he's on edge. More than usual." Ryland nodded but said nothing. They walked side by side down the sterile corridor. When they reached the room, Axel immediately lifted his head. His gaze locked on Ryland. No growl this time, just watchfulness, like he was weighing the sheriff's soul. Ryland stepped forward, stood at the foot of the bed, and looked at the man beneath the sheets. Elias's face was still bruised, his left hand wrapped, but even unconscious, he looked more alive than most men Ryland saw daily. "I owe you more than I can say," Ryland whispered, "and I failed you worse than anyone ever should. They said you refused to follow orders. They made you a traitor. But we both know what you really were." He placed the paper at Elias's bedside. "A man who kept his oath." Axel let out a low huff, resting his head again on Elias's thigh. A subtle sign of approval or memory. Carla stepped closer. "He knows who hurt him," she said softly. "And I think he knows who left him out there." Ryland's jaw tensed. "You think it was Weller?" "I think it was someone with a badge," Carla replied. "And that dog hasn't been wrong once." Ryland looked down at the envelope, then to the photo in his pocket. He turned it over and read the scrawled words again. "We made it home, all three, but one of them had been left behind. Not in Vietnam, not in combat, but here, in Pine Ridge, in silence." Ryland placed the photo next to Elias's hand. The old soldier didn't stir, but his fingers twitched just enough to touch the edge of the paper. Outside the room, Axel suddenly stood. His ears perked. He looked toward the west wing of the hospital, toward something no one else had heard yet. And then, without waiting for command, he began to move, silent, certain, as if he remembered something that had been waiting all these years to be seen again. The following morning, just as the hospital corridors began to stir with the soft shuffle of nurses and the groan of morning gurneys, Carla stood in front of Elias's room, her fingers wrapped tightly around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. Axel sat motionless beside her, his gaze fixed not on Elias this time, but down the corridor, westward, the same direction he had tracked the night before. Ryland emerged from the stairwell holding a slim folder and an expression carved from regret. "They pulled the property records like you asked," he said, handing it over. "The Lakeview house was signed over last year, not by Elias." Carla flipped the folder open, eyes scanning the legal transfer document. The signature scrawled across the bottom was shaky, inconsistent, barely legible. He couldn't have written this, she murmured, not with what the hospital found: arthritis, tremors, cognitive trauma. He was barely functional. This isn't consent. This is coercion. Ryland nodded grimly. Power of attorney was filed 6 months prior by his nephew Brady Moore. Claimed Elias was mentally unfit. Submitted an affidavit from a private clinic out of state. Never verified. Where is Brady now? Carla asked, jaw tightening. Running a roofing company in town, last I checked. Has a new truck, 2 investment properties, and hasn't filed a single VA benefit for his uncle. Outside town, the Lakeview property sat beneath a skeletal sky, its paint peeled like flaking bark, its shutters hanging by rusted hinges. The front door swung open under Carla's push, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the house had been gutted. Dust danced in fractured light beams cutting through the broken blinds. Picture frames lay face down, glass cracked. A couch with a torn cushion sat beside a fireplace stuffed with ashes. In the corner near the back door, Axel stopped. He sniffed once, then again, and growled softly. His paws began to scratch at the warped wood floor, then at the ground just beyond the steps. Carla followed. There, under a thin layer of damp soil and pine needles, was the edge of something weathered. Axel dug faster, his nails scraping dirt and root. Soon, a flap of leather emerged. A satchel. Carla knelt and pulled it free. It was an old army-issued bag, the kind issued in the late 60s SS. The clasp was rusted shut, but it gave with enough pressure. Inside was a notebook tightly bound with wire, its pages water-stained but intact. Folded inside the first page was a wax paper envelope containing a single metal key and a slip of paper marked in short, sharp dashes and dots Morse code. Carla squinted at the markings, her memory tugging at high school lessons and long-buried curiosities. She snapped a picture with her phone and pocketed the page. The notebook itself bore the initials EJ's. On the inner cover, Elias James Moore. She opened to the middle. The entries weren't standard. Each paragraph ended in seemingly random letters, phrases in Latin or more code. But some parts were readable. She flipped until she reached one that chilled her. July 7, 1972. They said we were clearing insurgents and women. We were ordered to burn the hut after the last scream died down. I refused. Boone didn't look at me. Santiago was already vomiting behind the truck. I held my ground. That was the day they started calling me the traitor. Not to my face, not yet, but I heard it in the silence. Carla sat back, heart pounding. She flipped further, skimming fragmented accounts of soldiers in darkness, of body bags zipped too soon, of orders barked over the hum of helicopters while farmers begged in broken English. Then, tucked into the binding near the back, was a folded page with bold black ink. Brady found out. I think he read the first half. He knows about the envelope. I saw him near the crawl space. If this is the last thing I write, Axel knows. Follow him? Axel nudged the edge of the satchel with his nose, then looked up at Carla as if to say, "You were meant to find this." That evening, back at the station, Carla laid the Morse code out on her desk and translated slowly. Letter by letter, phrase by phrase, the message formed. One officer shot civilian to provoke cover fire. It worked. Then 2 others joined. I filed a report. It was burned. Threats followed. I buried the copy near the creek bend, marked tree. Ryland entered the room, his shoulders sagging with something heavier than age. "You found the journal," he said, not as a question. Carla didn't answer. She slid the translated paper across the desk. Ryland read it in silence. When he finished, his eyes closed and he exhaled like a man letting go of a weight he'd carried for far too long. "Brady knew," Carla said. "He found the notebook, realized Elias still had proof of what happened, and instead of protecting him, he stripped his name off a mailbox, filed a signature Elias couldn't have written, sold everything and left him to rot in the woods." Ryland said nothing. He stared out the office window as the streetlights buzzed to life one by one. "He left him like a traitor," Carla whispered. "But Elias never betrayed anyone. He kept the truth even when no one wanted to hear it." Just then, Axel, curled by the office doorway, rose without prompting. His ears perked. He turned toward the door, then toward Carla. His tail gave a single, slow wag, not of excitement but of certainty. He began to walk. Carla grabbed her coat and followed. Ryland paused, looked once at the journal, then at the dog disappearing down the hall. They were going back to the woods. Something else waited there. Not just a location, a memory, or perhaps a body. The wind whispered through the pine trees as Axel led them back through the forest with the determination of a soldier on mission. Carla followed silently, boots crunching damp earth, heart thudding with questions she hadn't yet formed into words. Ryland trailed behind, his steps slower, heavier, like every yard forward was a reckoning he didn't want but knew he deserved. They reached the bend of the creek by late afternoon. The water ran low in mid-autumn, revealing a scattered pattern of smooth stones and drifted debris. Axel veered off the trail just before the waterline and stopped in front of a towering tree marked with a single diagonal slash across the bark, deep, old, and unmistakably deliberate. Carla approached cautiously, glancing down at the gnarled roots as Axel began to dig. Within minutes, the metal tip of a small ammunition box appeared beneath the soil. Carla dropped to her knees and unearthed it fully. It was rusted shut, the latch crusted in orange flakes, but she forced it open with her multi-tool. Inside was a tightly wrapped oilskin bundle, and beneath it, a set of folded documents. She unwrapped them carefully, her breath catching as the contents revealed themselves. Photocopies of a field report, identical to the one Ryland had found in his own file, only this version was not redacted. The civilian casualties were listed by age. The names of 2 officers were circled. The cover page bore Elias Moore's signature, dated July 12, 1972, and stamped received but with no official response. Back in the hospital that evening, as fluorescent lights buzzed softly and monitors blinked in rhythm with fragile breaths, a nurse named Lillian Cross ended her shift by checking on Elias. She was in her late 60s, her hands still steady, her uniform crisp despite the long day. As she adjusted his IV line, smoothed the edge of his blanket, her eyes lingered on the angle of his jaw. Something familiar hovered there, not in the present but from long ago. She stepped back, her gaze sharpening, memory sifting through decades of dust. "My God," she whispered, "it's him." Later that night, after hours, she returned to the hospital with an old photo album clutched to her chest. She made her way to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the attending doctor. Then Carla, who had fallen asleep in the chair outside Elias's room. "You said his name might be Elias Moore?" Lillian asked quietly. Carla sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah, why?" Lillian opened the album and flipped through the pages, until she landed on a photo, sepia-toned, slightly faded, taken under a makeshift tarp during the monsoon season of 1972. In it, a young Lillian wore scrubs stained with mud and blood, her arms around 2 soldiers. One was unmistakably Elias, younger, stronger, eyes still untouched by the weight of betrayal. "He pulled me from a collapsed bunker during the shelling," Lillian said, her voice trembling. "I was trapped under debris, everyone else had pulled out. I heard the building creak, knew it was going to give. Then I saw him. He was the last one in, carried me on his back across 30 yards of fire." Carla looked at the photo, then through the small glass panel of Elias's room. "You're sure?" Lillian nodded. "I never forgot that face. He never asked for thanks, just said, 'We don't leave our own.' Not ever." She closed the album and placed a hand over it. "He saved my life." As night deepened, Carla remained near Elias, flipping through the recovered documents again. She glanced up at the man in the bed, still asleep, still drifting somewhere between memory and silence. That's when it happened. Elias stirred, his brow furrowed, his lips moved, just unintelligible murmurs. Then clearer, a voice strained with sleep but etched with pain. "We didn't bring them all back." Carla leaned in. "What did you say?" Elias's eyes twitched beneath the lids. "They're still out there, Hugh Charlie Company. We left them behind." He exhaled sharply, chest rising and falling with a tremor. I promised I'd find them." Axel rose from his spot by the foot of the bed and climbed up carefully, pressing his head to Elias's chest. The motion calmed him instantly. The trembling slowed. The voice faded into a whisper. "Not all of us made it, but we were supposed to." The next morning, Carla sat with Ryland in the break room of the sheriff's office. the box of recovered documents between them. "He's been reliving it every night," she said. "That's what the dreams are, the voices. He never stopped being over there." Ryland rubbed his temples, weariness in every line of his face. "We all carry ghosts. But he carried their names." Carla pulled out the report. Lillian had identified the one listing the missing soldiers Elias believed were never recovered. "You think he's right?" she asked. "That the bodies were never brought home?" Ryland didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said finally. "But if anyone would remember, it's him." Carla tapped the envelope. "Then maybe he didn't bury this for justice. Maybe he buried it so someone would remember." In the days that followed, Elias remained unconscious, but the hospital staff began to notice small changes. His breathing was stronger. His grip, when they adjusted his sheaths, was firmer. Axel never left his side. The story had begun to trickle through town, first in whispers, then in phone calls. That the man found in the woods wasn't just a drifter, that he wore the airborne patch, that he'd survived, and that somewhere there were still names not carved into any wall, still waiting for someone to bring them home. That evening, just past sunset, a stranger appeared at the hospital, an older man in a faded marine jacket with a cane and a limp. He said only 4 words before sitting beside Elias's bed. "He never left us behind." Then he opened a folded piece of paper and began to read aloud. The file lay open on Carla's desk, the printouts arranged like pieces of a broken code that, when aligned, painted a story no one in Pine Hollow wanted to believe. She rubbed her eyes, scanning for the 3rd time the transactional history embedded within the housing deed. Elias had supposedly signed a string of routing numbers leading not to a local bank, not even a national institution, but to an offshore account registered to a holding firm in the Cayman Islands. The account holder's name, B. Moore Holdings LLC. The signature, Elias Moore. The handwriting, not even close. A forensic specialist from the county lab had already confirmed the inconsistency. But the money trail, that was what made Carla's blood run cold. The same Cayman branch had appeared in a recent federal investigation into embezzled VA benefits and laundered pension funds siphoned from elderly veterans with no next of kin. Brady Moore's name hadn't come up then, but now it was written all over this town's shame. Carla stood, pacing the length of the office as Axel's ears twitched in the corner. The dog had grown more agitated every day since Elias's rescue. As though the closer they came to the truth, the more Axel felt it rip through his own memory. She returned to the desk and clicked into the folder Ryland had provided earlier that week, a personnel file from West Ridge Military Academy, sealed and long forgotten until a favor pulled it loose from the archive. Brady Moore's record was stained top to bottom. 2 infractions for excessive force during cadet exercises, 1 reprimand for threatening a junior with a blade during hazing, and finally a formal complaint filed by Staff Sir Elias Moore, then an instructor on rotation, temporarily assigned to discipline and behavioral review. It was Elias's report that had triggered Brady's dismissal. In his statement, Elias wrote, "The subject demonstrates a clear disregard for chain of command, an obsession with domination rather than leadership, and a capacity for cruelty that I believe will endanger others if left unchecked." Carla leaned back, heart thudding, remembering the line from the report recovered in the woods. Brady found out. I think he read the first half. The journal wasn't just a confession, it was a warning, and Brady had turned that warning into a roadmap for vengeance. She picked up the phone, dialed Ryland. "I need you at the station," she said, "now." When Ryland entered, he carried that same slow dread in his shoulders, the kind of weariness that only comes from betrayal you helped create. Carla didn't look up. She slid the transaction printouts across the table. He had the account. It's offshore, laundered through a shell company registered in Miami. And the signature, Elias didn't sign that deed. He couldn't have, not with his physical state. Ryland studied the numbers, the names, the connections. "You know what this means," he said quietly. "We have a felony fraud case. Elder abuse, theft, wire fraud, possibly federal charges if the VA gets involved." Carla added, "This wasn't random. Brady didn't just want the house, he wanted Elias gone. He wanted him erased." She turned the screen toward Ryland, displaying the academy expulsion record. Elias reported him, ruined his chances at a military career, and Brady waited years to get close again. When no one was watching, he stepped in, claimed power of attorney, and quietly stole everything. Ryland's jaw tightened. I should have seen it. He showed up at the 4th of July cookout last year, remember? Said he was back to help take care of his uncle. I believed him. Carla leaned forward. Because that's what people like him do. They come back just long enough to seem useful, long enough to get a signature, a document, a name on a form, and then they vanish. She pulled another document from her drawer. A record. Brady's been claiming caregiver benefits for 2 years. Collected nearly $18,000, 0 cents before Elias went missing. None of it reported to adult services. Ryland's face darkened. And Elias, he never filed a complaint. He couldn't. Carla said. He was isolated, cut off. I think Brady kept him sedated or manipulated his access to communication. She paused and then dumped him in the woods when the guilt became too risky to hide. Ryland exhaled sharply. This town used to look out for its own. Then it stopped looking, Carla replied. That night, Carla drove out alone to confront Brady. Axel sat quietly in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the road like he understood where they were headed. The Moore Roofing office sat behind a Shell station off County Road 9, a one-off prefab with tinted windows and too many locks. Carla parked under the single flickering street lamp, hand resting on her sidearm, not because she expected trouble, but because she knew people like Brady always kept one lie left in their pocket. She knocked once. No answer. Again. Silence. Then the door cracked open. Brady's face peeked through, smiling too wide. Deputy Finch, he said. Carla showed him the folder without a word. He looked down, eyes scanning the numbers, the signature, the name of the bank. The smile faded. I don't know what you think you have, he began, but she cut him off. I have enough for a warrant. Enough for the feds. But what I really want is the truth. Brady leaned against the doorframe, confidence returning like slime beneath skin. Truth? You want truth? The truth is he ruined me. Sent me packing from West Ridge like I was some damn monster. That house, that money, that was mine, should have been mine since day one. Carla's voice stayed low. So you left him out there, chained to a tree like an animal. Brady didn't answer. His silence was confirmation. Axel stepped forward, standing between them, eyes locked on Brady. His body went still, his tail low, not wagging warning. And then he growled. Not the kind meant to intimidate, the kind meant to remember. Carla's voice dropped. He's not barking because you're a stranger. He's barking because he knows what you did. Brady's smirk cracked. You can't prove it. We don't need to, Carla said. Because Elias is waking up. She turned, leaving him in the doorway. Axel's steps falling in line beside her. The leash was loose, the silence between them heavier than any siren. Back at the hospital, the night shift was changing over. Lillian Cross stood outside Elias's room, holding a small box wrapped in faded canvas. He went home, she told Carla, handing it over. Found this in the attic, thought it was gone, but maybe he'd want it now. Inside was the metal Silver Star, awarded for valor, dated September 1972. Recipient: Silas J. Moore. Carla held it carefully. He never told anyone. Lillian's eyes welled. Because that's not why he did it. Because alive. Axel, Elias whispered. You hear? Axel stepped through the door without waiting. The room was dim, its light filtered through the early morning gray that bled past the blinds. Elias stirred beneath the layers of hospital linens. Breath shallow but no longer erratic. The steady rhythm of machines hummed softly, each beat a quiet reminder that time was still running. Carla sat beside him, a styrofoam cup of coffee cold in her hands, eyes fixed on the old soldier's face. She'd spent the last 6 nights here, watching over a man she didn't really know, but felt in her gut was someone too many people had chosen to forget. Axel lay curled at the foot of the bed, his breathing in perfect sync with Elias's own, as if the dog had adjusted his very soul to match the one he had once served beside. The room was silent, until Elias's hand moved beneath the blanket. Slowly, his fingers curled and reached outward. Carla blinked, then sat forward, carefully taking his hand in hers. His grip was weak but deliberate. Then, with eyes barely open and voice gravel rough from days of silence, Elias whispered, If I die, promise me something. Carla leaned in, unsure if he was lucid or trapped in memory. Anything, she said. Softly. Elias tightened his grip ever so slightly. Let Axel go back. Vietnam, here. These woods. There's something left. We didn't finish. We didn't bring him home. His voice cracked on the last word, and Carla felt her throat tighten. Elias's eyes locked with hers, clear for just a moment, burning with a memory too large to carry. He waited, and I never came back. That same afternoon, under the fading autumn sun, Carla parked the cruiser at the edge of the woods near mile marker 14. Not the place Elias had been found, but close. It was a section of pine ridge they hadn't combed before, a trail overgrown with thorns and forgetfulness. Axel stood at the forest's mouth, unmoving, staring down the old deer path as if pulled by a force far older than command. Carla clipped the leash to his harness but didn't hold it tight. "All right, boy," she said quietly. "Show me." Axel moved instantly, not with urgency but with quiet certainty. Nose low, ears high, each step precise. Carla followed, boots pressing into damp soil, the crunch of leaves beneath her sounding louder with every minute. They walked for nearly half an hour before Axel stopped at a sloped embankment near an old rusted sign half swallowed by ivy and moss. It read Restricted Military Property, 1976. Just beyond it, hidden beneath a thick growth of vines and branches, lay a slanted mound of earth. Axel approached, nose twitching, then began to dig. Carla dropped to her knees, clearing brush and deadwood, until the outline of a rusted hatch emerged, circular, reinforced with iron bolts, and sealed with decades of silence. She gripped the handle, strained, and felt it give with a groan that echoed into the trees. The hatch creaked open, revealing a stairwell descending into blackness. She pulled out her flashlight and looked at Axel. The dog answered by descending the steps first, paws silent against concrete. The air grew colder with each step down, heavy with mold and old war. At the base was a narrow hallway, lined with decayed storage crates, peeled paint and a water-stained ceiling. Axel stopped suddenly, his body rigid, head turned toward a darkened alcove to the left. Carla swung her flashlight that way, the beam catching something glinting from the shadows. She stepped forward and her light landed on a figure seated against the far wall. Skeletal remains still clad in the tattered remnants of a combat uniform. The bones were slumped forward, hands crossed over the lap, rusted dog tags hanging from the collar. Carla's breath hitched. She moved closer, heart pounding, then reached out and gently lifted the tags. They read, Santiago D, blood type, serial number, unit designation. She froze. The name Santiago had appeared once before, on the back of the photograph found in Elias's collar. Moore, Boone, Santiago, 1971. We made it home. All three. Except they hadn't. One had never left this place. She lowered the tags, kneeling before the remains as Axel sat beside her, head bowed. Carefully, Carla reached around the body. Near the hip, under a fallen pack, she found a journal half preserved in wax casing. Inside were sketches, mission dates, coordinates, each one matching the blacked-out portions of Elias's old report. Santiago had known, he had documented it, but he'd never escaped. Above him, scrawled across the concrete in fading charcoal, were 6 words. I waited, but no one came back. Carla felt her hands shake. Santiago had survived the operation, had found shelter, had waited for rescue. But with Elias dishonorably discharged and Boone forced into silence, no one had ever come. No chopper, no search party, just time, and eventually oblivion. Axel lay down beside the bones, his chest pressed to the ground, eyes locked forward like a guard dog returned to post. His presence wasn't ceremonial, it was familiar. As if even through death he recognized the man. Carla whispered, You knew him, didn't you? Axel didn't move. She looked down at Santiago's resting place and reached into her jacket, pulling out the photograph of the 3 men. She placed it gently on the floor beside the tags. Then she rose, turned on her radio, and called it in. Sheriff's office, this is Finch. I need recovery at Grid 17 Pine Ridge East Sector. Found remains, ID tags confirmed. Over. The reply crackled through the speaker. Copy that, Finch, are you sure? Carla looked down again at the figure slumped beneath decades of memory. I'm sure, she said. We found the one they left behind. Axel let out a low sound, not a bark, not a whine, just a breath that trembled at the edges like something sacred. Carla didn't say anything else. She just stood beside the bones, hand resting on Axel's head, heart slowly understanding that this was what Elias meant, that his story hadn't ended in a hospital bed, that his promise to bring everyone home had simply taken longer than anyone expected. The conference room inside the Pine Hollow Sheriff's office was dimly lit, its blinds drawn halfway as if ashamed of the confrontation unfolding beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights. Sheriff Ryland Boone stood at the head of the long table, jaw set, hands firm against the thick file folders spread before him. Across the table sat Brady Moore, arms crossed, a carefully curated smirk carved into his face. His button-down shirt was perfectly pressed, his Rolex subtly peeking from under the cuff like a silent declaration of arrogance. "This is ridiculous," Brady said for the third time, his voice laced with contempt. "Dragging me down here like some street criminal over what? A crazy old man's accusation." Ryland didn't flinch. He reached into the folder, withdrew a set of stapled pages aged, creased at the corner. He flipped to the last page and tossed them onto the table with a single snap. "That crazy old man filed this report in July of 1972, Ryland said. "He named you by implication, and it confirms what we found yesterday in the bunker near mile marker 14. Brady leaned forward, the smile flickering. "You found that old place, so what?" "It was condemned years ago." "Not condemned," Ryland corrected. "Forgotten, like the man we found inside it, Sergeant Daniel Santiago. Dead, 45 years, left behind like garbage." "You know who didn't forget?" Elias. Brady's expression twisted, a flash of unease cutting through the practiced indifference. Ryland continued, "You wanted to bury him, but instead he brought us to someone you helped erase. And now we have your offshore accounts, your fake signatures, the VA fraud trail, and a sworn testimony from a surviving combat nurse who saw Elias carry her out of Hugh under live fire. Your story doesn't hold anymore. His does." Brady sat back, the leather of his chair creaking beneath the shift of his weight. "You have no legal proof I had anything to do with that man's condition." Ryland picked up another sheet of paper and held it between his fingers. "Maybe not in court, but I've got enough to bury your name in this town. And maybe," he leaned forward, voice lowering, "maybe we'll find some prosecutor out there who's tired of hearing about technicalities protecting men like you." Brady's smirk returned, brittle now. "You think people care about some washed-up soldier's delusions?" Ryland's eyes narrowed. "No, I think they care about justice. Something you wouldn't recognize if it sat on your chest and stared you in the face." The door behind them opened without warning. Carla stepped in, her face pale but resolute. At her side was Axel. The dog walked with silent purpose, no leash, no command. He stopped in the doorway, gaze locked on Brady. The room fell into a hush so deep Ryland could hear the faint click of the wall clock. Axel didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stood, tail seconds, each one stretching like judge. Then, without a sound, Axel turned around, slowly, deliberately, and walked out. The message was clear. Rejection, not fear. Disgust, not anger. He hadn't forgotten Brady, he had chosen to disregard him. The most damning silence of all. Carla walked up to the table and placed a photograph between them. It was a print of the one found in Elias's coat. More Boone Santiago smiling in younger years, untouched by time and lies. But this copy had something else written on the back in fresh ink. "He didn't forget, neither should we." She turned to Brady, her voice even. "Your uncle saved lives. What did you do with yours?" Brady had no answer. His jaw clenched, but the words didn't come. Ryland stood tall. "You'll hand over the deed to the house. You'll return the remaining funds. And you'll submit a written statement transferring your power of attorney back to Elias, effective immediately. Or, so help me, I will have every biker veteran from 3 counties lined up on your driveway with enough banners and bullhorns to shut your business down by sundown." Brady scoffed. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Ryland leaned in, whispering low and hard. "No, that's supposed to remind you who you stole from. Not a senile old man. A soldier. A friend. And the only decent blood you had in your godforsaken family." Brady rose abruptly, knocking his chair back. He grabbed the file, papers fluttering as he fumbled. "This isn't over." "No," Ryland said, his voice cool as steel, "it's just beginning." Brady stormed out, the door slamming behind him, the echo lingering like gunfire in a canyon. Carla exhaled and turned toward Ryland. You think he'll sign? He will, Ryland said. Men like him care more about silence than punishment. He'll fold if it keeps his name off the front page. In the hallway, Axel sat patiently by the exit. As Carla approached, he stood, tail giving one single wave before returning to his calm, watchful posture. Good boy, she whispered, bending to scratch his ear. He knew, he always knew. Ryland joined them, glancing down the corridor toward the open world beyond the double doors. Now what? Carla looked down at the faded photo still in her hand. Now we go back. There's one more name we haven't cleared yet. You mean Santiago? No, she said. I mean Elias. Ryland's brow furrowed. He's safe now. Safe, Carla echoed. But not finished. He still thinks he left someone behind. Still thinks there's one more promise unkept. She pulled out her phone and opened a digital scan of the journal recovered from the bunker. There's a final entry. Coordinates, barely legible. But they're here. Same forest, northwest quadrant. Ryland nodded, his eyes weary but sharpened with a purpose he hadn't felt. Then we keep following. Not we, Carla corrected. She looked down at Axel, him. Without hesitation, Axel stood and began walking. The wind stirred softly through the trees surrounding the courthouse lawn, carrying with it the smell of pine needles, dry earth, and something older, something like reverence. There were no loudspeakers, no flags at half-mast, no fanfare, just rows of folding chairs arranged in neat silence under the canopy of the old oak that had once seen the worst of the war dead honored in Memorial Day tributes. This time, the gathering was different. No names had been carved in stone. No war had just ended. But somehow the entire town knew they were here to correct something, to realign a truth they'd forgotten. In the front row, Elias Moore sat wrapped in a dark wool coat, his back straight, his cane resting across his knees. He wore his boots cleaned and polished but worn at the soles and a navy cap bearing the faded insignia of the 101st Airborne. His eyes scanned the faces slowly, not with pride but with quiet disbelief. At his feet, Axel lay curled, unmoving, head resting across Elias's shoe, as if staking claim to the man and the ground beneath him alike. Ryland stood off to the side, out of uniform, holding a folder against his chest and watching the townspeople as they arrived. One by one they came: teachers, gas station clerks, nurses, barbers, farmers, students moving not with solemnity but with something gentler. Respectful, unhurried, like each of them was offering a part of themselves. The town hadn't sent invitations. No official proclamations had gone out. The only notice had been a single flyer tacked to the church bulletin board 3 days prior. Community gathering, neither sired, 10:00 a.m., in honor of one we forgot. That was all it had taken. Carla moved among the crowd, clipboard in hand, directing chairs, making space, keeping order not as an officer but as a neighbor. When the final seat was filled, she stepped toward the front and nodded once to Ryland. He cleared his throat, stepped forward and said only one sentence into the handheld mic. Sometimes the quietest names carry the loudest echoes. Then he stepped aside. What followed wasn't a speech or a moment of silence. It was motion. One after another, people rose from their chairs and approached Elias where he sat beneath the tree. No one said much. Some didn't speak at all. A few placed hands gently on his shoulder. Others just nodded. There were tears, yes, but no spectacle. Just acknowledgement. A woman in her 60s knelt beside him and whispered, "My brother was in your unit. Said you carried him across 4 miles of jungle. He never forgot." Elias nodded once, eyes wet but unblinking. A man in work boots and a faded flannel shirt placed an old photo in Elias's lap. 3 men standing in front of a bunker, one of them barely recognizable as a younger Elias. "You saved my father," the man said. "He gave his name after you." Elias looked down at the photo for a long time. His hand shook slightly as he touched the edge. "I thought he didn't make it," he said hoarsely. "He made it," the man replied, "because you wouldn't leave him." Later, when most had returned to their seats, a young boy no older than 8 stepped forward, gripping a cardboard sign nearly as tall as his torso. He held it above his head with both arms and didn't say a word. The sign was simple, drawn in marker, letters uneven but full of intent. "You're my grandpa's hero." Carla stepped closer, crouched and asked him softly, "What's your name, honey?" The boy didn't take his eyes off Elias. "Mason," he said. "My grandpa was in the army. He said a man named Elias pulled him out of a river when he was shot. He said he owed him his life. I wanted to say thank you." Elias stared at the boy as if trying to remember 100 different rivers and too many faces. But then something shifted in his expression. Recognition? Maybe. Or maybe just grace. He reached out and laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He was a good man," Elias said. Mason nodded and whispered, "He thought you were the best of us." After the boy returned to his seat, a hush fell again, not empty silence but the kind that follows understanding. Ryland returned to the mic. Mr. Moore asked for no medals, no plaques, no parade. But he did ask for one thing. He reached into his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded and yellowed. 45 years ago, a man named Daniel Santiago disappeared. His file was closed, his name left out of roll calls, his body lost. But Elias Moore remembered. And because he remembered, Daniel was found. And today his remains are finally going home. Gasps filled the air. Carla stepped forward with the flag-draped container in her hands, the same that had held Santiago's remains from the recovered bunker. She placed it beside Elias's chair. Elias reached out and rested his hand atop it. Eyes closed for a moment too long. Axel stirred but didn't move. His tail thumped once against the ground, not out of happiness but recognition. In that moment, something passed through the crowd. Not grief, not pride, something deeper, a reckoning. They had walked past this man for years, had seen him wandering the grocery store aisles, sitting quietly on park benches, passing unnoticed at parades. They had not asked who he was. They had not wondered why he never spoke much, why he looked toward the woods like they held something sacred. And now, faced with the full weight of who he had been and who he still was, they came forward, not for celebration, but for apology. The pastor closed the ceremony with a quiet prayer, asking not for blessing but for remembrance. "May we never again mistake silence for insignificance," he said. "May we never walk past sacrifice and call it invisible." As the crowd dispersed slowly, pockets of conversation formed. Some shared memories of other forgotten names. Others placed mementos near Elias's feet, dog tags, ribbons, letters, medals long stored in dusty drawers. But Elias didn't speak again. He simply sat, a man whose story had been reclaimed not by vengeance, but by witness. Carla remained last, standing at his side, watching the sun drift lower through the oaks. "You were never forgotten," she whispered. "We just forgot how to look." Elias didn't reply. He simply turned his head, eyes finding Axel, then the line of the horizon where pine gave way to sky. And somewhere beyond that stillness, something else began to stir. The house on Lakeview Road stood quiet at first, its wood groaning in the early frost like a man stretching after too many years asleep. It had taken the town less than a week to undo what time and silence had allowed to rot. Shingles replaced, windows cleaned, a new coat of white paint applied by teenagers on ladders who hadn't even been born the last time the front porch light had been turned on. Neighbors came and went, carrying boxes, tools, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, paint cans. No one asked who was in charge. They simply acted, like each nail driven into the wall, each photo frame rehung, was a penance spoken without words. Inside, the furniture had been restored or replaced. The walls were still the same off-white shade of age, but now they bore history proudly. Black and white photos lined the hallway, Elias in uniform beside nameless soldiers. Snapshots of townsfolk from years gone, a young man grinning on a float beneath an American flag. Near the fireplace, someone had framed the photo found in his coat. Moore, Boone, Santiago standing shoulder to shoulder, whole, and next to it an empty frame labeled for the names still out there. The house was no longer just a place, it had become a monument in motion. Elias sat in his rocking chair near the front porch window, the one facing west, the one that caught the amber wash of afternoon sun just before it slid behind the pines. He wore a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled back, cane propped against the wall beside him. On his lap was a leather-bound journal, edges slowly, the pen trembling slightly but his writing steady. He'd flipped to the last page hours ago, reading every word he'd scrawled across the years. Field notes, unsent letters, coordinates, names, promises. Today, he wrote something new. One final sentence. It took 40 years to be called by my name again, but it was worth it. All of it. He capped the pen and closed the book with quiet reverence. At his feet, Axel lay sprawled, head resting across one of Elias's worn boots, ears twitching now and then at the distant hum of a lawnmower or the trill of birdsong. The dog hadn't left Elias's side since they'd come home. He'd walked through every room, sniffed every corner, lingered longest in the living room where an old army blanket still carried his scent from years ago. Now he simply lay there, guarding nothing, at ease. Elias reached down, hand trembling just enough to betray age, and scratched behind Axel's ear. The dog's tail thumped once against the wood of the porch. "You didn't just find me, Axel," Elias said, voice barely louder than breath. "You reminded me I was still here." The sun dipped lower, catching the edge of Elias's glasses, glinting in Axel's eyes as the dog blinked slowly and sighed like a man who'd finally been allowed to rest. From inside the house came the sound of a kettle clicking off, followed by the voice of Lillian Cross, humming an old tune as she prepared tea in the kitchen. She had moved in temporarily, insisted on helping until Elias got his strength back fully. One hero deserves another, she always said. On the front lawn, a group of middle school kids rode past on bikes, one of them yelling, "Hi, Mr. Moore," without hesitation, as if he'd always been part of the neighborhood. Elias nodded, lifted a hand in slow greeting. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The mailbox had been replaced the day before, handcrafted by a local carpenter. On the side, engraved in dark walnut, were 3 simple words: Elias J. Moore. Below it, in smaller print, "Not forgotten, just quiet." Visitors had begun arriving not to gawk or gloat, but to listen. Veterans from other towns, men who had served in different wars, different branches, showed up just to sit for a few minutes on the porch steps and share silence. Some brought patches, others left coins on the windowsill. One man handed over a harmonica and said, "He saved my cousin. That was in '73. Never got the chance to say thank you. Maybe you can play him something." Elias took the harmonica and nodded. That evening, just after sunset, Carla arrived with a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was the flag that had covered Santiago's remains during transport to the family he had left behind in California. Alongside it was a note from Santiago's niece. He waited. "We didn't know. Thank you for going back." Elias held the flag for a long time, then placed it gently over the arm of the chair beside him. He looked out over the quiet yard, the porch bathed in twilight now, and whispered, "We're all home now." Axel stirred again, lifted his head and licked Elias's hand once, before settling back into stillness. The rocking chair creaked gently beneath the weight of memory and time. No wind, no cars, just the sound of floorboards and the soft breath of an old dog who had never once stopped believing his soldier was still out there. Elias leaned his head back, eyes half closed, hand resting lightly atop the journal that now held everything. And with the last light of day catching the edge of his smile, he whispered once more, "We brought them home, boy. Even me." Axel didn't move. But he didn't need to. They were finally exactly where they belonged. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us share more untold voices like Elias's. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it Axel's quiet loyalty, the town's awakening, or the final words in the journal? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Let's see how far this moment has traveled.